So, as I mentioned in the previous video, there will be a lot to say around the historic events of this week. I'm sure I'll be making other videos related to this, but I'm not quite sure what order or what specific area I'm going to look at. I'm sure there'll be lots. I've just watched the coronation concert. It was quite good actually. It was sometimes these things are a question of do you recognise all the artists. And I don't really follow that much contemporary music, but I thought it was quite good. I thought if anyone watched it, this was the big concert outside Windsor Great Park, or at Windsor Great Park. The King and Queen were in attendance, so was the Prince and Princess of Wales and other senior royals, and huge crowd, about 70,000 people, I think. Would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. But yeah, I thought it was very good. I thought the drone effects of the animals was fantastic, spectacular, very well put together. So I've just watched that, but I want to talk about an area of these proceedings that has come up, and I wasn't sure if I was going to talk about this because I think it is marginal in the sense that it impacts a minority of people or has involved a minority of people, and it is really a very small minority. I'm referring to the anti-monarchy protests that have taken place in London and elsewhere, mostly London, I think. And there's been some degree of controversy because arrests were made. And in some cases, the police basically physically manhandled people and took them into the back of vans, and they were held for quite a while, in one case 16 hours. Now, there's a lot to say about this. It's an important issue. Of course, it's an important issue regarding democracy and the extent of freedom to protest and so on. But I do want to put in my take on this because I feel that there is a lot of distortion going on, quite frankly. Um, and I take issue with that because I think the distortion is leading to a negative perception of this country that simply isn't the case. So I want to address this a little bit. Now, I'm going to put a disclaimer here before I get into talking about the Public Order Bill, which has got royal assent this week. It's passed. Because it's very important that people understand the details of that. Before I get into it, I want to be absolutely clear. I'm a monarchist. I consider myself a moderate monarchist. But I absolutely support the right for Republicans to hold their view. I accept that not everyone in this country is for the king and for the institution, and they have a right to their opinion. We must not become like Thailand. I quote Thailand in contrast because I haven't been there, but I've closely observed Thai politics and the situation there. I've been involved in speaking up for dissidents, in a sense. Long story, but basically, we do not have lèse-majesté laws in this country. In other words, there is no statute in Britain in 2023 that says you're forbidden from criticising the monarchy. It doesn't exist. And we haven't actually prosecuted a lèse-majesté case, I believe, since 1715, which would be the reign of Queen Anne, or the beginning of the reign of King George I. Basically, since the Glorious Revolution in this country, we morphed from an absolute monarchy into a constitutional monarchy. The absolutism was briefly restored under Charles II and James II, but then the Glorious Revolution changed all of that. This is not to say that suddenly we became the democracy that we are today in 1688. It was a long process, and there wasn't universal male suffrage until the Great Reform Act. There wasn't, of course, women's suffrage until the 20th century. So by no means am I saying that with the Glorious Revolution we suddenly became a democracy. And you could still be transported or imprisoned for certain offences related to royalty, not lèse-majesté, but there was one case of a character who tried to assassinate Queen Victoria and he was transported. But quite frankly, if you tried to assassinate anyone, you'll face a hefty punishment. So in that sense, it's not like Thailand. You're not going to go to prison in Britain for tweeting a rude cartoon about the king. You're just not. And I think I mention this because I hear a lot of hyperbole. I hear things like Britain's no longer a democracy. We no longer have freedom. And and this sort of thing. It's that needs to be challenged a little bit because whilst I don't think we can ever be complacent, and I think that any new legislation does need to be very closely scrutinised, I don't think hyperbole helps either because it distorts the context of why new legislation is brought in. So, one side of this will be the cynic who says, oh, it's brought in because the Tories just want to be more authoritarian and it's kind of this undermining, shadowy, sinister attempt to bring in a big brother state. Although, actually, some conservatives would say it was New Labour that excelled in that, but, because it's New Labour that pushed for ID cards and more CCTV. Um, but I think it's very important to understand the context of this. Why has the public order bill been brought in? I think the answer is obvious. For years, about 4 years now, militant activists, protesters, I'm even reluctant to call them protesters because I think it legitimizes them, have been really, really, really testing the public to the limit. They've been engaging in reckless and mindless stunts, utterly counterproductive tactics, and they are widely unpopular. Um, Now, what is true democracy? Is true democracy giving rights to the minority or listening to the majority? I would argue that the public order bill is, in fact, a democratic act. It's listening to the public, it's responding to public anger. Now, I'll come back to the principles around this in a minute because how this is defined is very important. Um, I'll read out basically what the loose definition of what this public order bill is. There's a whole spreadsheet actually on the government's website about what this entails, which I'll put a link to in the video so you can check for yourself. I'm going to briefly summarize it. But, I think there's a perception here that, oh, what's happening in Britain, people are being arrested for being Republicans. That is not happening. It's not happening. There are millions of Republicans in this country. They're a minority, but, it's a sizable minority, about 30%. It's bigger with younger people. It varies, from the regions and from nation to nation, but it's roughly 30%. Okay, so it's going to go into a few million people. Now, the vast majority of British Republicans are moderate. They don't believe that the institution belongs in this day and age, and they would like to see it probably gone, but they're moderate. They're not, you know, full of hate and out in the streets and demanding an overthrow of the monarchy and basically they're content with voicing their opinions and saying in their view it has no place in modern Britain. They feel it's immoral and they've strongly held views. But this is an important point because I think there's a perception that Republicans are being arrested, and if that message is being sent out in other countries, especially in the United States, where the media is even more sensationalist than our media, it's a false narrative. So this is a very important point. Republicans are not being arrested in Britain because they are Republicans. We have no rules against republicanism at all. There are no lese majest laws in this country. If you know anything about Thai politics, there's no Article 112. It just isn't. So in Britain today, you can freely say you dislike the king. You can freely say you don't think there should be a king. You can freely say, I wish to see an end of the monarchy. And you can freely say that. I could go to Facebook right now and say that, and nothing will happen. So this is a very important point. Now, some of those who were arrested, frankly, they were pretending to be Republicans. Maybe they are. But one guy, he opened up, he had a t-shirt, Just Stop Oil. Right now, this is a very important point because their accusation is the police are heavy-handed and, that we're no longer a democracy. But I would counter that and say this has been the biggest security operation ever. I mean, it's certainly on par with the Queen's funeral and the G20s over the years. It's, a major, major operation, 11,500 officers, thousands of people involved, millions watching around the world. It's a major event. And when you're policing the capital of the United Kingdom, I don't think there could be any room for complacency. And it's a balancing act because they can't just, arrest everyone and throw them in prison. But I would say if you have previously been arrested, if you're aligning yourself with an organisation like Just Stop Oil, which has engaged in criminal acts, right? This is not some passive organisation. It's an organisation that is engaged in sabotage. It's engaged in holding the public hostage. It's engaged in vandalism, reckless stunts. They're known for it. They excel in it, and they're proud of it. So, frankly, if you're a Just Stop Oil activist and you turn up to the coronation parade, you can't really whine about the police treating you with suspicion because it's your track record. This is the contention I have with them. They're whining that, it's heavy handed, we haven't done anything. And here's the irony. Maybe specifically on this occasion, they didn't do anything. They didn't vandalize anything or glue themselves to anything. But there was credible concerns that this was going to happen, that Just Stop Oil was ruling nothing off the cards. Now, again, this is a game that Just Stop Oil is playing. We're not ruling anything out. As it turned out, thankfully, nothing happened. But at one point, there was fears that they were going to let off smoke bombs in the procession, which, of course, would have spooked the horses, could potentially have killed the riders, caused a stampede. I mean, really, I think they're quite dangerous. And they keep pushing this narrative with just peaceful protesters. Well, let's look at that for a second. What constitutes peaceful protest? Because as far as they're concerned, and as far as their apologists are concerned, people like Ian Dunt of the Eye, whose op-ed I took issue with because he was, very much of the school of thought, protest has been banned in Britain, and he was pushing this narrative in his piece from the Eye, the 4th of May. But what constitutes peaceful protest? I mean, basically, if you look at their argument, what they're basically saying is, well, we're not throwing punches, we're not planting bombs, therefore we're peaceful. So what they're essentially saying is we can do anything we like, including breaking the law, including inconveniencing the public. No, worse than inconveniencing, directly targeting the public. Because one thing that Ian Dunt brought up in his op-ed was, well, look at the Iraq War, there was massive protests against that, but I contend that in 2003, and I was involved in those protests actually, I was at some of those rallies. Yes, it was a protest. It was, to oppose the Blair government's decision to invade Iraq and the rest of it. But if there was any disruption, it was a side product. So yes, in any large-scale protest, there will probably be some disruption. I contend that there's a big, big difference between a protest where you have disruption as a side effect versus a so-called protest where disruption is actually the intention. The intention. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, Just Stop Oil are a bunch of sociopathic idiots. That's putting it politely. I actually cannot stand them. I think they're potentially dangerous. So when they say that they're peaceful protesters, my question is, you're basically defining, or my point I would put to them is, you're basically defining peaceful protest as anything short of violence. But is that peaceful? Is it peaceful to knowingly cause stress? Is it peaceful to sabotage? Is it peaceful to mess with people's lives? I would say no, it absolutely is not. And I would say that the police were simply doing their job on this occasion. There's times the police do deserve criticism. They can be heavy-handed. And, for example, when they arrested the journalist at one of the protests last year because she covered the event, now that's wrong. There are times the police absolutely deserve criticism, and goodness knows the Met at the moment has plenty of skeletons that it needs to clear up. But I don't blame the police for taking a robust stance yesterday. I mean, think of it this way. If one of those hardline activists had got through, and goodness knows what they would have tried, maybe setting off some smoke bomb on the parade, maybe trying to vandalise some statue in view of cameras whilst the king was going past, something that is intended to get attention, to disrupt, that would have been a major, major headache for the Met. And they would have been criticised. The criticism would have been they were too complacent, they were hands off. Why did this happen? Now, as it turns out, I think they deserve credit for the day going by without major disruption. And the vast majority of people that went because they're either monarchists or tourists or people who simply want to, you know, be part of the event. I don't think it's necessarily a case that everyone who was there were neo-royalists. But I think even most Republicans would recognise that it's just punitive to go to an event solely for the purpose of disrupting it. Now, to me, that's looking for trouble. If I don't agree with something, I know that if I go to make a scene, it's not really practical. Now, the argument, of course, would be, well, simply doing what I'm doing here, uploading a video or making your piece online or whatever, it doesn't have the same weight. And their attitude would be all publicity is good publicity. I think that's boneheaded because the only debates, the only attention they've got has been negative. Anyway, with that being said, I'm going to read out the public order bill because there is a lot being said about this that I think needs to be clarified. Commencement dates. The following measures, this is from the gov.org page. I'll put this link up. The following measures in the public order bill will commence on the 3rd of May 2023. The definition of serious disruption in the public order bill, locking on, going equipped to lock on, interference with key national infrastructure, that's motorways and so on, amending the seniority of police officer in London who may attach conditions to an upcoming protest or prohibit a trespassery assembly to match that applicable in forces outside London. That's a bit of police bureaucracy, but what are we going to do? It's very important. This government fully supports the right of individuals to engage in peaceful protest. However, the serious disruption caused by a minority of protesters has highlighted that more needs to be done to protect the public and businesses from these unacceptable actions. So that's clearly a reference to the eco-extremists and a few others, but I think primarily the eco-zealots. And the point about this is the public has been demanding it. These new measures are needed to bolster the police powers to respond more effectively to disruptive and dangerous protests. Over recent years, guerrilla tactics used by a small minority of protesters have caused a disproportionate impact on the hard-working majority seeking to go about their everyday lives, cost millions in taxpayers' money, and put lives at risk. This has included halting public transport networks, disrupting fuel supplies, and preventing hundreds of hard-working people from getting to their jobs. Protests such as these removes police from the regular duties tackling crime in local communities. That's another point about all of this that shouldn't be overlooked. Measures in the public order bill will improve the police's ability to manage such protests and take a proactive approach to prevent such disruption happening in the first place. This in turn will ensure that police can better balance the rights of protesters against the rights of others to go about their daily business and to focus their resources on keeping the public safe. So that's it clarified. I mean, in his piece, Ian Dunn was saying it's poorly defined. I think that's quite clear, actually. How are we going to do it? Now, I'm not going to read this out in detail because it's quite long, but introducing new criminal offences of locking on and going equipped to lock on. Well, this is self-explanatory. One tactic that the eco activists used, and I don't want to smear all environmental campaigners, but one tactic that militants have used is locking themselves to buildings and to each other and to the ground physically, thereby making it difficult, near impossible, for the police to physically remove them without injuring them. And of course, if they got injured, they would sue the police and they would whine about their human rights being impacted. But what these people are doing is literally locking on. Now, one of them claimed that Dalton Locke was for his car. I don't believe that. I don't believe a word that they say because I think that they are incredibly manipulative individuals. These leaders are. I don't believe a word they say. I think it's a little bit ironic that they are calling for the public to support them when they have shown such utter contempt for the public. I mean, they're sociopathic in that sense. But, locking on is not part of peaceful protest. It's an act to disrupt. Introducing a new offence of obstructing major transport works. I mean, I would have thought this was already covered under highway laws, but it's more specific. And damn right. Again, that is not peaceful protest. If you're going to climb up on the structure of a motorway, closing down a motorway, impacting thousands of lives, goodness knows what sort of situations people are in, I have zero sympathy and I think you should go to jail, as indeed those two guys were that climbed up onto the M25. I have zero sympathy. The Queen Elizabeth II Bridge, actually, at Dartford, I believe it was. I mean, apart from endangering themselves, they endangered others. I mean, the host of issues that was brought about by that is just striking. Introducing a new offensive interference with key national infrastructure. I mean, this is a no-brainer. I don't know how anyone could have a problem with that. It's just a no-brainer. Because frankly, there is a fine line between what they're doing and terrorism. Terrorist sabotage. There's a history of terrorist groups doing this. Introducing new offences of causing serious disruption by tunnelling. Again, this is connected to infrastructure. Extending stop and search powers for police to search for and seize objects such as lock-on devices. Seems reasonable to me. They may be used in the commission of a protest-related events. Introducing serious disruption prevention orders, a new preventable court order targeting protesters who are determined to repeatedly inflict disruption on the public. This is for the militant zealots. That goes without saying. That is people who have shown no remorse. They keep getting arrested and they keep doing it. So absolutely there should be more robust actions against those individuals. Amending the seniority of police officer in London who may attach, that should be officers I think, in London who may attach conditions to an upcoming protest or prohibit a trespasser assembly to match that applicable in forces outside London. Extending the powers to manage public assemblies to the British Transport Police and the Ministry of Defence Police. Enabling the Secretary of State to bring civil proceedings in relation to protest activity. That would be the Home Secretary, I believe. Introducing abortion clinics, safe access zones. In other words, this is to stop women seeking a termination not to be harassed as they go in. This seems fair to me. I mean, I would say, pro-life campaigners, let them have a voice. But, if it's outside an abortion clinic, I think that can be intimidating if it's done in a way that's sort of harassment. Protection of journalists, this is very important. This measure establishes a safeguard for journalists, specifying that the police cannot use their powers solely to prevent a person from reporting on or observing protests. So that would take into account, for example, what happened to that reporter last year. Police can still lawfully exercise their powers, for example, of arrest or to maintain public order and public safety or for other legitimate purposes. They cannot, under this legislation, arrest a journalist for doing their job. Now, if the journalist is part of those groups and they engage in those activities, then they're part of the problem. But if they're simply, I as a freelance journalist, if I go to central London and interview a few Just Stop Oil people, they probably won't speak to me after all these videos, but, the police can't arrest me for that. And if they did, then, the police should rightly be condemned. I'll just round this up in terms of the background. Let's see, just see how long this is. I'll read this bit out. Current legislation to manage protests provides predominantly for powers to counter behaviours at protests which are violent or distressing to the public. These powers include those under the Public Order Act 1986, which provides the police with powers to manage public processions and assemblies, including protest sections 12 and 14 of the 1986 Act. Allow the police to impose any type of condition on a public procession or public assembly necessary to prevent significant impact on persons or serious disruption to the activities of an organisation by noise, serious disorder, serious damage to property, serious disruption to the life of the community, or if the purpose of the person organising the protest is the intimidation of others with a view to compelling them not to act. If they not to do an act they have a right to do, or to do an act they have a right not to do. This is getting into the finer details. That would be, for example, I'm talking about environmental zealots. Let's say you have anti-vaccine people who want to harass nurses or doctors, because this covers a whole range of things. Let me just round this up. There's frequently asked questions. Why are you introducing these measures? These are sensible and proportionate measures designed to allow the police to better balance the rights of protesters and the public. Recent actions by protest groups such as Just Stop Oil and Insulate Britain have shown that the government needs to act in preventing serious destruction. Well, again, I would go back to this democracy, because the point here is the public have been demanding it. That's democracy. the right of the majority. Now, if if the government ignored the public demands for action, would that be democracy? I honestly think that there is a serious question here of the tyranny of the minority, and I think the majority are wholly fed up with them. If you are blocking a road, if you're stopping people going to work deliberately, not as a byproduct, but deliberately, if you're vandalising paintings, do not tell me that you're a peaceful protester. I think you're little better than a petty criminal. I really have a problem with this constant mantra of we're just peaceful protesters. No, you're going out with a malicious agenda. So I really think that has to be underlined. Will these measures ban protests? No, these measures will not ban protests. These measures will only prevent a small minority of individuals from causing serious disruption to the daily lives of the public. I wondered did Ian Dunt actually read this before he wrote his op-ed because, given the alarmism that he came up with, I don't think that he did. Is there public support for these measures? Absolutely. A YouGov poll published in March 2022 found that close to two-thirds, 63% of the public support, making locking on a criminal offence. So the public mandate is there. A more recent survey also found 53% of those support tougher measures for activists blocking roads, transport and other infrastructure. Honestly, I'm surprised it is only 53%. I imagine the remaining 47 will be divided between people who are concerned that the legislation is poorly defined. I think only a very, very small minority will actually believe that protesters have a right to stop traffic deliberately. I really think that, that remaining 47% is going to be probably largely undecided. That would be my speculation. Are these measures compliant with human rights? Yes. Article 10 and 11 of the European Convention on Human Rights set out that everyone has the right to freedom of expression, assembly and association. However, these rights are not absolute and must be balanced with the rights and freedom of others. This is a point, about human rights, and I've long spoken out on this issue, and it's something that groups like Liberty and other human rights people in this country need to consider. And it's something I think they overlook. It's also a right of the majority. There's a right of the majority to not be impacted by militant protesters. As with existing public order powers, the police will need to act compatibly with the human rights of protesters when using them. And it gets into other questions here. I'm going to put a link to this, because it's very, very important. But basically, I feel that there's some legitimate questions about it. Of course, there's legitimate questions about how this is defined, but I'm getting a little bit sick and tired of militant activists claiming that their rights are the only rights that matter and that their human rights are being violated and we no longer live in a democracy and they're simply concerned citizens. They're not. They're petty criminals, they're anarchists, they are people who are determined to disrupt for disruption's sake. They're people who are determined to hurt the rest of us for some distorted sense that will wake us up to their agenda. I'm not going to claim neutrality in this. I have total contempt for Just Stop Oil. I think they're vile, and I think it is time that there was tougher measures against them. I think the worst situation would be here if the government done nothing. But it is very important that the police actually act on this. The police themselves have not helped matters. They've been slow to react. I think they've handled these eco-protests badly. I think they've been too soft, quite frankly. In many other countries, they would have been dragged away from the beginning, not offered cups of tea. And I know they've been a bit more robust since then, but it's a disgrace when you have frustrated motorists being told to stay back and the police walking around and the eco nuts are still gluing themselves to roads. It's insufferable, actually. Now I'm going to round this up at the half hour mark, but I'll close with this. I'm not an idiot. If I really genuinely believed that there was anything in this that seriously banned protest, I would be against it. I do think that people should have a right to hold placards, conduct peaceful rallies that are not deliberately trying to obstruct the public. But the difference with these green groups, these particularly militant green groups, and other protests is that other protests may cause disruption by proxy. The difference here is these groups are doing it deliberately. They're trying to hurt the public deliberately. I think that's contemptible. I think it's sociopathic. I think it's bad, a bad approach. I think they've utterly failed, and they need to understand, with rights comes responsibilities. Now they're basically saying we should be allowed to do anything we want, short of violence. So as long as they're not throwing punches and planting bombs, they can do whatever they want. That is their mindset. And it's a very entitled, narcissistic mindset. So I say cautiously because, you know, if it's extended or if there's any amendments to this bill that may extend powers, we do have to be cautious. But I say I cautiously welcome it. I think it is needed. I think that the police must act on it. And I think that when, if you're in another country and you're looking at this and saying, oh, the British are banning protests or the British are banning Republicans, this is not true. This is a distortion and it's not what is happening. And if you're a member of Just Stop Oil, even if you are specifically being not doing those stunts at a particular time, simply by associating with a group that has been doing that, frankly, you can't complain about the police not trusting you and taking precautions. That's my take on it.